to this lesson of the Polgar Chess University. In our previous lesson, we discussed about pins. Pins can be really dangerous. In this lesson, we'll discuss how to get out of pins and how pins are not always that dangerous. Well, let's get started with our first example. We're going to discuss various methods in how, in some cases, you can get out of pins. Here we go. This is our first example in this lesson, and we can see that the white rook on h1 is attacking the black queen, and since the black king and queen are right on the same file, the black queen is not allowed by the rules of the game to leave that h file. So what can black do? Obviously, capturing the rook in the corner would result a clear loss of material, as the queen is a much more valuable piece, being worth 9 points, than a rook worth only 5 points. So what should black do here? If he cannot capture the rook, there is no piece to interpose between the white rook and the black queen. Well, in this case, the solution is to force away the white king from g2, the one that's guarding the white rook, from the rook. And the way to do that in this case is to give a check with the rook on g8. Now, white has no other choice, well, other than blocking the check with the queen on g7, which obviously would just result in losing the queen as well, so that's not any help for white. So other than that silly move, the only other choice is to move the king out of the check, and then of course black is free to capture the white rook without losing the queen. So as we can see, even though white made the pin, it's black who comes out ahead. So remember, while pins can be very dangerous, they are not always. And let's see our next position. Here we go. Again, in this case, the situation is rather similar as in the previous one. The black king and queen are right on the same file, together with the white rook pinning the queen. Again, the black queen is not allowed to leave the d file because that would leave the black king in check, and that's not allowed. Again, the big question is, what can black do about it? Giving up the queen for the rook on d1 would obviously not be a good solution because the white queen would capture the black queen and gain 4 points on the deal. In this case, there is no way to pull away the hand of the white queen that is guarding that rook on d1, as we did in the previous example to the white king. In this case, black has an intermediate move. What that means is that instead of dealing directly with white's threat, instead black gives a check, kind of seemingly dealing with attacking white by doing something else. But by doing that, we put an additional piece onto the d file in between the black king and queen, and now whether the black king moves out of the check or pushes a pawn up, blocking it, the black queen all of a sudden becomes free to move away from the d file because the black bishop is there now. A very nice and practical way to get out of pins. And let's see the next position. where the situation is a bit different. In this case, it's the white rook that is in a pin. However, it's not an absolute pin. What is an absolute pin? An absolute pin is when the king is involved, when the king is behind the pinned piece. And what an absolute pin means, that you cannot move that piece because it would be an illegal move. In contrary, when we talk about a relative pin, as in this position on the screen right now, the pinned piece is allowed to move. However, it may result in losing a very strong piece, as in this case, the white queen on c1. So for example, if the white rook right now would move to c3, it would allow black to capture the white queen, and even though white can recapture with the rook, black would clearly come out ahead, winning a queen and losing just a bishop. Going back to the starting position, we may wonder, do we have a better way to continue here? Well, first of all, even just to leaving the rook where it is and losing it for a bishop is still much better than losing our queen for a bishop. But at any time, we should always look for ways to avoid losing material, losing any of our pieces, or losing a stronger, a higher value piece for a lower value piece. In this case, white can combine counterattack with the goal of avoiding losing material. If you notice, the black king is on the back rank without black having a rook on the 8th rank. Also, the 3 pawns on the 7th rank don't allow escape upwards for a black king. With all that taken into consideration, we'll notice that white has a beautiful checkmate threat to save his rook. By playing rook to b3, now black cannot really capture the queen, although they can, but they would regret it, because now the white rook would end up on the black's back rank, checking the king, and black can avoid the checkmate only for one more additional move by blocking the check, and the white rook will capture the queen and announce checkmate. So this is another typical and very effective way of getting out of a relative pin. Remember, if it's an absolute pin, that means you absolutely, by the rules, cannot move your piece out of the pin. However, when we are talking about relative pin, that is, the piece behind the pinned piece is not the king, you may have additional options. Let's see the next example where black is in a double pin. Look at that. First of all, the black knight on c5 is in an absolute pin from the bishop, and also that same knight is in a pin along the c-file from the rook. Luckily for black, there is a way to get rid of this problem by simply protecting the knight with the bishop. And now, as we can see, there are 2 attackers on the knight, and there are also 2 defenders. And black is home safe. Let's move on to our next example, where again a knight is, or at least seems to be, in trouble. The reason why the knight seems to be in trouble is that the white bishop on e3 is also on an unprotected square. That means that, for example, if the white knight would just move away to a random square like b3, then black could capture a bishop for free on e3. Compare that with white having his pawn from f3 being back to f2. In that case, it wouldn't be an issue. The knight could pretty much go to any safe square, such as b3 or c2 or e2, or if the pawn is not on f3, also to f3. But in our current position, the pawn is on f3. Because of that, there is only one correct defense in this position. And it's a move that protects the bishop at the same time. Can you figure out that move? And yes, that move is knight to c2. And now, if bishop trades, knight just takes back and nothing happened. So again, the pin wasn't deadly. And let's move on to our next example, where the black bishop on e5 is in a pin. What should black do about it? Well, defending the bishop with a pawn would allow white to put more pressure on the bishop by playing, for example, bishop to c3, and at the end of the day, after the trades on e5, win at least a pawn. In this case, in the starting position, black has an escape by counterattacking, by castling to the queen side. All of a sudden, the black rook appeared on the d file attacking the white bishop, and if rook captures bishop on e5, then rook captures bishop on d2. Again, black avoided losing material. Let's go to the next example, where the white bishop on f5 is the one in a pin. This is a tricky one. It's a relative pin because the bishop can move, but has to be very careful where to move. If the bishop would move, for example, to e4 or g4, that, of course, would be a big blunder, losing the queen on f1. How about capturing the pawn on d3, which protects the white queen on f1 simultaneously? That would be a mistake because it would land our bishop on d3 in a second pin. Namely, after the exchange of the queens, black would end up winning a rook. Let's go back to the starting position here and see what is the correct move. Rather than being greedy and capturing the pawn on d3, the correct move is to use the same idea of protecting the queen but not getting into a new pin. Now, white is safe, as after queen takes queen, bishop can safely take back, and then on the following move capture the pawn on d3 and have a winning or much superior position. Let's move on to our next example. In this position, the white knight is the one in trouble. Unfortunately, any place that knight would jump to would still leave the bishop on d4 hanging. And the only square from where the knight would protect the bishop is unsafe because black could simply capture it by the knight or the pawn. And the black bishop is guarded by the pawn on a7. So this would simply result in a loss of a knight. So what may be white's option to avoid losing material here? Well, here, thanks to the fact that the black knight is on an unprotected square on f8, white has at his disposal a counterattack. Try to find the correct move. And that move is moving the bishop to g7, attacking the black knight. So now, if the black bishop or pawn captures the white knight, white will do the same, capturing the black knight. And of course, if the black knight moves away, then the white knight is free to go. Try to remember the different methods. While the positions most likely will be different, or even very different, the ideas of trying to escape from a pin will be very similar. And let's move on to the next example, example 9 in this lesson. In this position, the white knight and queen are on the same file with the black queen. And black played c5 in this position, trying to use the pin. Now this is a tricky situation. Seemingly, white has several moves that may save him. For example, knight f3. The knight moved away while protecting the queen at the same time. Yet this would be a big mistake, because it would allow for black to make a forceful capture and say check, and after king captures bishop, all of a sudden the white queen is history. So that would be a big blunder after c5. Knight b3 would be a bit better, because black cannot capture the white knight, because that would leave the black queen hanging. But black would still win at least a pawn after moving the queen to e7, and now the white knight is still under attack, and while that knight moves away, black would get to capture the white pawn on e4. So let's go back and see how can still white save the knight, avoid losing material. Well, it's an idea we already saw an example of in one of the earlier positions in this lesson. And again, the saving idea is a checkmate idea, checkmate on the back rank. Did you find it? Here is the answer. The correct move is queen f4. And now black does not have time to capture the knight, because the queen would appear on b8 and would result in checkmate on the following move. If black opens up the window for the king, then already the white knight is free to jump away and avoid losing material. Let's move on to the next position. Here we go. In this position, it's the white knight that's in a pin. And black can try to play f5, attacking the knight and try to use that pin. Now if that knight just jumps away, the problem is that the rook on e1 is unprotected and the black rook will capture that white rook. There is a good-looking move, knight f6 check, but in reality that would be a blunder, because in addition to the pawn capturing the knight, which would be of course bad because it would allow white to capture the black rook, the black knight can also capture, protecting the rook at the same time. So again, after playing f5, what is white's defense? How can white avoid losing a knight? It's again an idea we saw earlier. By moving away the piece behind the pinned piece by counterattacking an enemy piece. Here, the best black can do is win a pawn, win the pawn back because white was a pawn ahead in the starting position, trade the bishop for the knight, and then capture the pawn. And now there is material balance. Let's move on and see the following position where the black rook on e6 is in a relative pin. That means the rook is allowed to move, but better be careful where you move it not to lose your queen. And here again it's one of those intermediate checks. The black rook gets to move away to e1, and when the white king moves out of the check, the black queen is free to run away anywhere. The next example is a real simple one and basic one. In this position, the white rook is pinning the black queen. However, it's not guarded sufficiently. Black can simply capture it. That's another method to escape trouble caused by a pin. Let's see yet another different idea on how to defend against pins. Here the black queen is in an absolute pin. It cannot leave that diagonal. And if it remains on that diagonal, moves somewhere on that diagonal, the queen will be lost. Luckily for black, black can block the pin, block the attack to the queen, and maintain the extra pawn without losing the queen or any material. We'll see the same idea repeat in the next position. Here it's quite obvious that white has a material advantage at the moment, having an extra bishop and one extra pawn. It's also clear that black is attacking the white queen. The white queen is in the same rank with the king and therefore cannot leave the second rank. Can you see the saving move here? It is to retreat the white bishop to block the attack. And again, white is home safe. In fact, white is threatening to checkmate black in 2 moves by getting the white queen close to the black king. Let's move on to the next position, where the black rook is the one that's in a pin. In fact, it's in an absolute pin. The rook cannot move. Yet, black can simply defend the rook and in fact unpin it. And the move is moving the bishop to e6. And let's move on and see a new idea. In this case, the black queen on c7 is in an absolute pin. Here the method is to get rid of the pinning piece. However, if black would try to do that immediately, white would just capture the black queen after queen takes bishop. Luckily for black, black has another better move at his disposal. By giving first an intermediate check, bringing a new piece to attack the white bishop on g3, and only after the king moves out of the check capture the bishop, but of course not with the queen, but with the knight. And again, black is home safe, having an extra pawn, avoided losing material. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this position, white quickly captured the black knight by playing queen captures f6. And this is a famous example that I personally used many times in my games. Here, we're making a sacrifice to remove the pinning piece. Even though black gives his queen up only for a rook, as you can see as the end result, black is who comes out ahead, now being an exchange up. Because white, with its initial move, won a knight, then black sacrificed the queen for a rook and captured the white queen. So black gave up a queen and a knight, but gained the opponent's queen and rook. A very famous idea. Let's see the next example. Here again, white tried to win a knight by using a pin along the b file. In fact, white is also threatening to checkmate on the following move by capturing the pawn. However, white forgot that the rook on b1 is on an unprotected square. And here, black can use another motif, creating a fork, a double attack. Check, and now whether white blocks the check or moves the king, and then black ends up winning a stronger piece than what they lost, and also the checkmate threat has been resolved. And finally, a last example on this theme. Here we go. In this position, it would be a big mistake for white trying to win the knight by playing rook takes on d3. It's true that at the moment black is unable to capture the rook because there is a pin, but black has a real tricky method of making a discovery to get out of the pin and not leaving white time to save his own rook. And here the move is king h5 check. And after king moves, no more pin, pawn can take the rook. Well, I hope you enjoyed these examples and remember the various methods on how one can get out of pins. Thank you for listening. Hope to have you back next week. So long.